Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this database lesson. This is Jacqueline Corley, and today we are talking all about security and SQL injections. Now, this had always been my plan to be a lot more conceptual. As you know, at the beginning of the semester, I had mentioned that there would be a couple of lessons that would be PowerPoint more conceptual, and this was one of those ones. And so primarily because it's a little difficult for us to do some of the security permissions, but if you pay close attention, I believe that you will get a good foundational understanding of security and the ways that you can secure your database, and also how you can prevent some SQL injections, which is a very, very common hacking tool today. Okay, so the objectives that I have for you today, we're going to discuss in detail the components of database security and how a lot of those many aspects contribute to those components. And then also I'm going to define what SQL injections are and then teach you how to prevent them. So first, let's talk about the components of database security. So there are four different components. They are authentication, encryption, authorization, and access control. These components are actually not unique to database components. If you have ever worked somewhere, even if you're an employee at OBU, or even if you haven't been an employee anywhere, you know that these types of components are all throughout. We have various different types of security components that we even utilize at this university. And when we talk about them, I'm going to mention what those are. So these are actually very common, and we have seen these before, and you tend to see them throughout your regular life as well. So first, here is authentication. Authentication allows validation of user permissions to access the system. Okay, so this basically allows you to be able to have access to the system, but validates that you are that person. Okay, so the most common method is username and password credentials. So that's one of the reasons why they always say ensure that your username and password is not something that can be guessed, because if so, you can easily have your access, I guess the word I'm looking for is compromised. Okay, so you want to make sure that your username and password are really good. Usually when you go and work somewhere, they will ensure that. Now this third one, single sign-on, is actually something that OBU has. If you notice that when you sign on in DegreeWorks or maybe Canvas or your email, once you've signed into one of those things, you can usually go ahead and go to the link of another one of those things, and you'll already be signed in. So let's say you signed into your email. Well, you should be able to then go to the Canvas link, and it automatically allow you to sign in to the Canvas link because you've already signed into your email. So that's just a visual understanding of what single sign-on is. Okay, so next one is encryption. And if you've been in computer science long enough, you understand what encryption is. This scrambles data into gibberish to protect against potential interceptors of data transmission, okay? And SQL Server Management Studio uses something called RSA encryption, all right? So that is what SQL Server Management Studio utilizes, but I'm also gonna talk a little bit more about encryption later as well. Okay, so authorization. Of course, this determines which resources you have specific access to, but the prerequisite is that you have acceptable credentials. So kind of thinking also about that single sign-on system there. that has basically already pre-authorized you to be able to access some of the other resources, such as if you were to sign on into Canvas, you should then be able to go onto your email and such without having to sign in again. So that's just another reminder of authorization. But normally the prerequisite is to have acceptable credentials, and the main credentials are usually a username and password. Okay, so when you go out, even in the industry, especially if you're working as a database professional, more than likely you are going to have authorization to be able to have majority of the resources, as far as database access goes, because you would be the DB administrator, or you would be the report analyst, or SQL analyst or database analyst like I was. You would have certain permissions to be able to go out and do that. The only thing that I have not seen anyone have authorization to are past databases that are no longer applicable or no longer needed. Now, those that would more than likely probably go to the DB administrator, especially if they are looking to clean up that data. But usually, rarely have I seen anyone have authorization to access those things. But if need be, it would go to someone who is more a database administrator. Okay, so access control. This one aspect of access control is change tracking. And simply what this does is it's able to track various changes within the database. Okay, so what happens here is the changes are logged, so that way we can potentially see unauthorized users. Okay, so let's say something happens inside of the database and there was a change made, and we noticed that, oh, wait, that was done by somebody who's unauthorized. Okay, then we're able to literally see that and log that and take the potential steps in order to ensure that we are properly giving access where needed, and also understanding maybe any vulnerabilities that may happen in our access control that we would need to change. There's also a concept with access control related to power users or super users, which are users with elevated permissions that may have access to all systems for various reasons, but that doesn't necessarily authorize them as users of the database. So let's say a networking professional may have access to all of the systems because they are trying to ensure that everything is working properly with the networks, but that doesn't mean that they will have access to the database itself, because that's not something that they would be authorized to utilize or to use. So one thing that change tracking does is it helps protect the system from various operations that could be performed by users who have such elevated credentials. So just keeping in mind that access control really is meant for you to have certain access to resources, but you can also track those who can potentially try to perform actions and they're not even authorized to do so. Okay, so that's one part of access control that is important. Okay, so going on to the security model, there's a 3-class security model. Okay, and in this model, there are 3 different classes. The 3 different classes are principals, securables, and permissions. Okay, principals simply allow you to have permission to access specific objects or specific areas of the database. Securables are simply resources in the database that have system regulated access. Okay, so these are things that are already automatically in the system that have been generated for you to have access to. So as you know, one of those things I can give you guys an example is if you remember from the stored procedure lesson, where I mentioned that there are system stored procedures that you can go ahead and utilize. Okay, that's kind of an example of system regulated. And then permissions. The permissions give you the right to view, edit, or delete these securables. Okay, so basically you can set those permissions for people to be able to view, edit, change, delete, whichever you want, but these are usually predetermined again by your credentials or certain roles that have been set up in the system with certain permissions for various people to have access to. So if you remember from the stored procedure lesson, when I created a role that allowed for Marco to be able to have access to the stored procedures only, but he could not see the specific tables or the specific columns of the databases that I was working out of. So that's one example of giving proper permissions. Okay, so now let's talk about database schemas. So these simply define ownership of the resources, and they identify principles based on user relationship to the owner. So let's go back and see what principles are. They're permission to access specific objects. Okay, so these specific principles are identified based on the user's relationship to the owner. Okay. And the way that we can define that, Microsoft actually has a great definition of this, is a group of database objects under the ownership of a single individual. And together they create what is known as a single namespace. And here in a minute, I'm going to mention a couple of schemas that you may have seen already as we have been studying databases. What this does, this single namespace ideal actually promotes data consistency. So the way that I mention this is no two different objects that are part of this namespace can be named the same. Okay, so remember, data consistency is the important thing. And we all know this already based on not just lessons that we've already learned, but just in general, we want to make sure that the data is consistent. And these principles can be single user or single logon, or they can be a group principle, or there can be multiple people who have access to this. So I want to give you guys an example of a couple of schemas that you may have seen. When we are creating tables, a lot of times you might see something that says DBO.person. Okay, DBO is the schema in which that table exists. DBO stands for database object. It is the default schema that the tables can exist in. Okay, schemas can be changed. However, I have rarely seen them changed in industry. Usually, the only time that I have seen schemas even utilized or changed is usually in the beginning of the database build, because you're wanting to ensure that a specific schema defines a certain set of tables properly. So another schema that you may have seen is SYS, which stands for system. If you remember from the stored procedure database, there were some stored procedures with the schema SYS, letting you know that it is part of that system single namespace. Okay, so those are just a couple of schemas that you might see. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, how do you determine what these schemas are? Those are usually determined by the company's needs or what the company actually does. So I remember in industry, we had a couple of schemas that maybe were related to financial or some other schemas. We did have the system schemas. We also had the DBO regular schema. But we also had some other schemas that were related to just other aspects of the company. So, but normally you would mainly utilize the DBO schema, and that is the default schema in a database. So that's kind of the ideal namespace there that that's talking about. Okay. Now let's go on to server roles. Okay. So there are actually two different types of roles in not just in SQL Server, but also just in databases in general. There's server roles and then there's database roles, which I'll talk about here in a minute. The server roles actually allow access depending on your title and responsibilities. So if you are a maybe senior IT director, you might have some different access based on your role. I know that personally I had some server roles, but I didn't have very many because my main job was to be on the database. Okay. So that's really just going to depend on your title of the company and what your responsibilities are. And then sometimes these responsibilities can override your title. So, for example, um, if there was a certain thing that I had to do that was part of my job description, then maybe both the IT director and myself would have the same permissions, but he or she would have those permissions just based on them having the title to oversee everything that I would do. But I would still have those same permissions because my responsibility requires me to have those. So that's just one way that your responsibilities could override your title, meaning that even though you are even though you are a even though you are a senior manager or whichever, then you would probably still be able to utilize some of the responsibilities that maybe the IT director would have as their title, but because you have certain responsibilities as the senior manager, you would have the same permissions on certain levels as maybe the IT director, where the IT director would simply just oversee what you are doing with those responsibilities. So that's kind of what I mean by your responsibilities overriding what your title may be. And then these permissions are managed at the server level. So like I mentioned, there are database roles and we have permissions managed at database level that we'll talk about. And then there are fixed server roles that SQL contains. So in SQL Server, there are certain roles, which that's what it means by fixed server roles, is there are certain server roles, that cannot be changed that automatically come with SQL and SQL Server. And you can, we'll definitely talk about those in just a second. And then as you know, you can also create custom server roles. So if there is a role that, you may, that maybe, SQL Server or the server itself does not have, you can definitely create that role as well. But right here are the main server roles inside of SQL Server. So basically as a sysadmin, so basically you're the system administrator. You pretty much have the ability to perform any action within an instance of SQL Server. Bulk admin allows users to import the data from a file using the bulk insert statement. Decreator allows members to create new databases within the instance. So if you are wanting to create a database, you would need to ensure that your role is decreator. And then disk admin allows members or users who have this role to manage backup devices in SQL Server. Okay, so if part of your job is to ensure that the company has proper backups, then you would use a disk admin. Process admin members are allowed to kill running processes or stop instances. Okay, which that can be needed sometimes. So that is a good role there. Public, all logins that are added to this role are used for internal operations like authentication. So if you're behind the scenes of authenticating everyone to have access, then this would be your role as public. And then the security admin, users who are involved in this role can manage logins at the instance level. Basically, an example of that would be assigning permissions. And then server admin, this combines both disk admin and process admin and can shut down the instance. So um, this role basically combines process admin and disk admin permissions. And then lastly is setup admin. The users who are attached to this role can create and manage linked servers. So again, you can also create your own server roles with a certain number of positions. Okay, and what I'm going to do toward the end of this video, once I go through everything, is I'm actually going to go out to SQL Server and show you guys where some of this stuff is so that you guys will know where you can access this. Now, database roles, again, these can depend on title and responsibilities, and that should say database roles instead of server. And then custom roles can be created as well. So database roles in SQL Server are DB Access Admin. Okay, this can add and remove database users from the database. So if you want to remove someone, let's say someone who worked at the company is no longer there anymore, you can remove them if you have admin access. And then DB Backup Operator gives users the permissions they need to back up the database. And then Data Reader, DB Data Reader can run select statements against any table in the database. And then Data Writer can perform data manipulation language statements against any table in the database. And DML language statements are simply the things that we were doing before, such as insert, update, delete, all those types of things. And then DB Deny Data Reader denies the select permission against every table in the database. So when you are selecting items, you're simply requesting the database to read the data. Okay. And then that's why denying data reader and data reader are important, because that will indicate whether you are able to read the data or not read the data. And then you could probably guess that deny data writer would not allow you to have permission to perform DLM statements or DML statements against every table in the database. So you wouldn't be able to edit, update, delete, etc. Okay, and then DB DDL admin, you're able to create, to run the create, alter, and drop statements against any object in the database. So if you remember from when we were doing modifying tables, okay, you would want to ensure that you have access to the DB DDL admin in order to do that. And then DB owner can perform any action within the database that has not been specifically denied. Okay, so as long as you haven't been denied permissions, you can perform any action when you have DB owner. And then DB security admin, you can grant, deny, and revoke user permissions to securables, okay, and can add or remove role memberships with the exception of the DB owner role. So let's go back really quick and remember what securables are. They're resources in the database that have system regulated access. So the security admin role allows you to be able to grant, deny, and revoke those permissions to those securables. Okay, and with the exception of the DB owner role, obviously. Okay, and then if you want to create a new role, a security, new, and database role, and again, this is what I'm going to show you guys here on SQL Server toward the end of this lesson. Okay, now there is something called mixed mode authentication. You guys have seen Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication, but there is something called a mixed mode authentication. This allows you to connect to the database through a secondary tier of authentication. So this is basically like providing another level of authentication. Then users and passwords are stored in the database, which is another reason why we have to ensure that SQL injections do not happen, which I'll get into in a minute. There's a special user for this called SA. Now, one thing you want to be careful to do is by default, this is actually called the SA account. So you would want to make sure that you change this in order to prevent hacking, because it's one of the easiest usernames to guess. Most very smart hackers know that SQL Server utilizes SA as the main administration account. So you want to go in and change it. And the SQL statement to do that is alter login SA with name SQL Server admin A. Okay. So SQL Server admin SA. So they will not know to type in SQL Server admin SA normally when they're trying to hack. They're going to more than likely use SA because that is the most common name for this special user. So you just want to go in and change that login name to something that cannot be guessed. But it's recommended to, stick with Windows or SQL Server authentication, and mainly because you usually have a unique login with each one of those that is very difficult to guess. Okay, now there's actually something called master key encryption. Now we're talking a little bit more about encryption. This is used as a root of SQL Server encryption, and it's automatically created when a new instance is built. So if we have a new database, if we have a new table, if we have a new anything, okay, this key is created when that's built. What it's used for is to encrypt database master keys, credentials, and linked server passwords. So anything that could, give you maybe access or inappropriate access into the system is what master key encryption is utilized for. Now, these keys are stored in the master database, and there's only one key per instance. If you want to take a look at, how to utilize these keys, your book in chapter 13 does a very good job of describing how to utilize these master keys. So you can take a look at those there. Okay. And the last thing with encryption is something called transparent data encryption, which is TDE. And this is the process I have outlined here on how to actually create TDE. Okay. This is just a much better way of doing encryption utilizing master keys and all of that. So just a really brief description of what transparent data encryption is. It's simply just a technology that's utilized to encrypt database files. So TDE, which is the acronym for that, offers encryption at the file level to ensure that data at rest is protected. So basically data at rest meaning any files related to the database. And so this encrypts databases both on the hard drive and on backup media. So basically this is utilized for mainly encrypting files. So here's the process on here on how to do that. So what you do is you create a database master key, then you create a certificate once you have that key, and you use that key to encrypt that certificate. So if you try to do this by password only use, it will give you an error. So that's why you utilize the key to encrypt the certificate. And then once you do that, the database remains accessible once this process is implemented. But the things that are not available are anything where you're trying to do maintenance on the database, anything where you're trying to drop a file, drop a database, detach a database, take a database offline, or setting the database to read only. Okay, so those are the options that are not available when this encryption is taking place. Okay. And again, if you want to see like a more clear description on how to create a database master key, your textbook for this class that I've given you or have assigned for this class in chapter 13 does a great job of showing you guys that. Okay. So that's just a little foundational knowledge on a lot of the security aspects. So one other thing that I want to show you guys first is how to actually utilize this in SQL. So here's an example on how to do TDE in SQL. So use master, which master is one of the 4 main databases in SQL Server that, like we learned at the beginning of this semester, and then create master key encryption by password. Okay, so it utilizes a password, but we want to ensure that we utilize a master key encryption with that password, which is why it's stated that if you use a password only, it generates an error. Okay. Then create certificate, TDE certificate with subject assigned to certificate for TDE. Okay, so now you can go on and encrypt your database and you can establish appropriate permissions from there in order to prevent further errors, especially in database access. Okay. So that was a little foundational knowledge about security. Let's now talk about SQL injections and how they work. Okay, so just in brief, what is a SQL injection? This is a type of hacking method to gain database access. So the primary focus here is to try to obtain access to the database. So unauthorized access is obtained by retrieving database details, and I'll show you in a minute with an example on how that can happen. So here's what tends to happen. So there's a prompt box that prompts you for certain data entry, okay? That maybe you see that, okay, well, it's saying that it's going to give me this information if I put this information in, right? But what will happen is you will not retrieve the desired information. And what happens is there's a statement that runs through the database and the user is unaware. So that's one of the main ways that it can happen. Okay. One way though that this can really happen is this. So consider this SQL statement below. So select all from users where the username is assigned, a specific username and password, right? So this is just kind of the default statement. Doesn't necessarily mean that username is someone's username and password is someone's password. This is just indicating that, you can put in any username or any password. Well, here's what a hacker would attempt to do. Select all from users where username is assigned, double quotes, or a single quotes around X, assigned single quotes around X, and password assigned double quotes or single quotes around X, assigned single quotes around X. This X assigned to X statement will always prove to be true. And what happens is if a hacker puts that in, what happens is they can easily retrieve access to all of the details inside of the database. Okay. So what will happen is this query right here would return all the rows in the users table. Okay. So then the attacker can log into the database and then do what they want. So based on any user, and more than likely they'll be able to see the user's permission and such. So they can get in and do whatever it is that they need to do now. Okay. So it's very, very easy for an attacker to gain access just by using this very small trick. Okay. So here's the other thing about this users table too. It could also be very large and have millions of records. Okay. So in that case, this can actually result in a denial of service attack simply because um, the system has so many resources that may be overloaded, making the application unavailable to the users. Okay, so this can cause actually one of two things or both. It could cause the hacker to be able to see all of the user names, all of the users inside of the users table, all of the records. But it can also cause a denial of service attack if there are millions of users, which can tend to be millions of users depending on the how many branches maybe a company has. You know, um, think about airports and various airlines that have various different airlines all over the world, and their companies have different branches. So think about all those users and all those employees and things like that. So think about those large companies that can have millions of records. And when this hacker tries to attempt, what happens is the application or whichever the application that the users use that the database is working off of, that can actually go down and be inaccessible and cause denial of service. So it could cause one of two things or even both. So that's one of the reasons why SQL injections are so scary and can be very risky because they can even cause other problems. But here's a third one, a third thing that this can cause that it could be even more scary and even more devastating. What if this statement that the hacker used contained a delete or insert or update statement? That's where SQL injections really get tough because then the hacker would be able to insert inappropriate data, making the data inconsistent, or delete or update things, making also, if you update something, making the data inconsistent. But then also, if you delete something, then causing data loss. So that is also another thing that can be devastating as well, which is why SQL injections are one of the top hacking types that can be protected against or need to be protected against because so many things can happen. Okay. So really the biggest way to prevent these is a couple of data validation ways. Okay. So this will help secure your database from SQL injections. One type is pattern matching, another type is utilizing a light quandary. So pattern matching, you basically have the option to search for data patterns. And by doing so, if you don't know the exact word or phrase, you can utilize certain characters or certain strings in order to create a pattern match. This utilizes wildcard characters. An example of that is right here, it has double quotes, the, and then the %sign. Okay, you can utilize this to match any string that begins with a capital D. Okay, so that's how pattern matching works. Now, with a light quandary, you must have an escape method in order to change the characters. So you can pretty much set a certain escape method in order to change any characters. Okay, so if you remember, one of the scariest things in SQL injections is deleting and updating or even inserting data, especially updating. Okay. So the light quandary helps you to be able to have an escape method in order to be able to change characters. And then you also have something called the add slashes function, which allows you to ensure that you're specifying the range of characters that's needed by the system in order to escape. So basically, in a nutshell, you would need a certain escape method in order to be able to change anything inside of the database. That will help prevent SQL injections. Okay, so that is pretty much what I wanted to share with you guys on a foundational level of security and SQL injections. As with any topic in SQL Server or computer science, there's always more to learn. But I want to take a moment to take you guys out to SQL Server and show you a couple of those things that I wanted to show you guys that that you would need to know as far as where some of these things are located that I mentioned earlier. So let's go out to SQL Server really quick. All right, so before I logged into SQL Server, I wanted to show you all where I was talking about the authentication methods. So right here under authentication, we know we have Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. But when I mentioned mixed method authentication, sometimes there would be both. And that would show up here to be able to utilize whichever one. But of course, you know that we are using a SQL Server authentication. Now here since we're out on OBU server, we do not have mixed authentication. We just have these top two, but these two, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones that are recommended anyways. So I wanted to show you guys that before I got logged in here. So one quick reminder of where the master database is located, because when you are utilizing the TDE encryption method, you want to ensure that your database is using database master. So database master is right here under system databases, and the tables that are there simply, I guess this is the only table there, department. Here's the columns, DNAME and location. So I guess in this particular master database, that's all that we have. Okay, let's see if we've got any views. We don't have any, only system views in here. But this is the master database where you would want to utilize that. This is also the place where you can find the other three main databases that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester: Model, MSDB, and TempDB. If you want to remember what each of those are, you can go back to the very first lesson that we had in class, and you can learn more about those. But this is where you can find those system databases that you would need in order to perform certain actions. Now, I also mentioned earlier about server roles. So you would simply scroll from the top all the way down to security. So make sure you are not within a database, because this is not the same. These are for security logins and server roles. So you go all the way down to security, and then that's where you can find the necessary logins, but server roles are here. So you can see all of those server roles that I was discussing in our lesson. That's where you can find them. Okay, you can right click on one and see the properties. So I'm gonna right click and, so if you wanna create a new server role, hold on just a minute. Let me right click on that. If you want to create a new server role, there's that at the top. You can script that out if you want to. Then also down here, here's the properties. Okay, so you can see the properties of the actual bulk admin role. Okay, we know that the only person who has this role is Gary B. Nickerson. Okay, so which is appropriate because it's only for specific OBUIT members for this specific role. And then, so that's what you can do. You can literally right click on any of these and see their properties. You can right click on server roles folder and simply create a new server role. You can click on that and create a new server role. And you can give access based on this, and then you can see, you can add which members or which users you would want to add. Okay, and you can browse for users that need access to this certain role. Okay, so if I needed to give a certain role to you all, then I can easily do that by going here to create this when I'm creating this new role. Okay. And then once I've selected everyone, I would simply hit OK, cancel. Okay. So you can also remove people if there was the ability to be able to remove. We don't have any role members, so and then you can click on this to see the different types of memberships, and you can just click on whichever role that they would need to be part of too. Okay, so if you want them to be on multiple roles, you can create a certain role for that if you wanted. Okay. And then these are the securables that I kind of mentioned earlier. And then here's are the permissions. Okay, so you can grant specific permissions based on, these securables that I mentioned earlier. Okay. And you can decide, who is going to be the owner of this as well. Okay, so you can cancel that out. Now let's go to database roles, and I'm going to simply go to my people database and open that up, and then I can go to security here, and then I can see which users have access to this. And of course, Marco still has access to this from our last example that we did on stored procedures. Okay, so then we can see various database roles, and here they are. Okay, simply now you can right click on database roles and hit new database roles. So we'll go there, and then it's pretty much the same, except the only thing is we are giving now database permissions and database schemas that are owned by this role, that we want to be owned by this role. Here are the securables. Okay, so of course you have to specify a name in order to click on the securables tab. Okay, and you have to specify a name in order to get to extended properties. So this has a lot more strict rules in order to do that. Okay, so let's call this test role. Okay, so as long as you have a name in the roles, then you can look at each section. And so for the securables, you can specify which ones you want and which permissions that you would want. So remember, the securables are certain resources that you would have, and then you can grant those permissions based on those securables. And then extending properties. So extended properties is just another part of SQL Server based on the database, whichever properties that you want to give. We click on the three dots here. Now that would only be if you had something. Okay, and if you needed to delete a property, you could if need be. Okay, we're gonna hit cancel. And then let's right click on database roles again, and we're gonna see the properties of access admin. So we know that this owned schema is DB access admin. Let's look at, so it doesn't have any extended properties. Okay, so this owner is DBO. So this was the database schema that I was talking about. So DBO is the default schema, and any of those tables inside that default schema can be part of that. Let's look at object types. So this application roles, users, and database roles. Of course, you want all those checked. Then, of course, you can browse for object names. And those objects that you would want to have access to it. Now, they already have to have access to this database if you want to assign them to a certain role. And you can see from last time where I had my DB stored procedure only access, and you can see the type of role if you want to. So let's go ahead and just pull this out. So you can see the actual role type. So it tells you it's a database role, and it tells you it's a user. And as you scroll up, it will tell you whether or not it's a database role or if it's simply just a user. and users and database roles are considered objects to give certain permissions to. Okay, so that is database roles. Okay, here's where you can find all of the schemas. So there's actually a folder called schemas where you can find all the schemas. And you know, DBO is also the default schema, and SYS is the other schema that I mentioned to you guys earlier. Also, here's where you can find the database certificates. We do not have any certificates for this particular database, so you will not find any. But as I was talking about certificates earlier, here's where you can find them. And then for encryption purposes, if you create asymmetric or symmetric keys, you can find those here. Okay. Basically, what those are is a symmetric key. This would employ the usage of the same key aimed to perform encryption and decryption. And then an asymmetric key includes the usage of a pair of keys, one for encryption and one for decryption. So to encrypt the data, you would use a private key, and to decrypt the data, you would use a public key. So that's a little bit about asymmetric keys and symmetric keys. But just for now, all you would need to know is that's for encryption purposes. We mainly talked about master key creation, which is the main one utilized for SQL Server, but you can utilize asymmetric keys and symmetric keys as well. Again, those would be dependent on the company's needs for encryption. Okay, so, and if you perform any database audits, those specifications can be found there too. Okay, so that is the security section of the database. Okay, last thing, just a quick review of where you can find these logins or users. So there's users of the database, but as far as the server security, here is where you can find all of the logins down here. So all of our logins, so all of you have logins to SQL servers where you can find them. Here is that SA account that I was talking about as well, that we would definitely want to change. And of course, I don't know if our university would, but we also don't really, I don't think we really utilize SQL Server. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I know that this was provided for this course for us to use. But normally with an SA account, you definitely don't want it to say SA, again, because that's an easy way for hackers to guess logins. Because what happens is the system administrator SA account has really good logins based on all the permissions that it has. It has really good login permissions. That's the account that has access usually to everything. So this account is usually more susceptible to the SQL injections, and is usually utilized as the one that a lot of times hackers go for. Now, if it's a certain database that they're trying to hack, let's say the people database, this is where that users table example comes in, because databases have something called users instead of logins. So that's where that users thing comes into play, okay? So I just wanted to show you guys where some of these things are in SQL Server so that you guys can see them. Now, the last thing I'm gonna show you is the credentials section. We don't have any credentials. But if you were to have credentials stored in here, this is where it would be stored, okay? But really the gist of just showing you guys this is just to give you guys an overview of what you can expect to see inside of, especially if you're using SQL Server database tools. If you're using something like MySQL or Oracle or PostgreSQL, it may be a little different, but SQL Server is the primary one that I've seen used in industry. So if you come across this in industry, you will see that this is how the setup for database security and server security actually are set up. So I hope that this gave you a good foundation of just a little bit about security and why SQL injections are dangerous and why we want to avoid them and how we can do that. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video, which will also be more on the type of security role as we're going to be discussing deadlocks.